Thank you, John, and thanks once again to the organizers for putting this together. This is a wonderful experience to see that the narratological community assembles from all over the world, this time in Paris. After an excellent lunch, which normally slows you down and makes you drowsy and a bit tired, I thought I'd better start off this talk with some audience participation. So here we go. I will show you slides, pictures of 3 men. And the question to you is, who do you think is the most controversial and the most stimulating thinker of the 20th century? Is it the dear leader in the center? In case you wonder what he's looking at a fruit box. Sorry, wrong one. So is it the dear leader in the center? Is it the distinguished gentleman on the left? Or is it the dynamic intellectual on the go that you see on the right? Take your pick. And now comes the solution. It's actually the distinguished gentleman on the left. So it's not the beloved leader who we see looking at a juice box, and it's not the intellectual, but it is the portly gentleman that we see standing there with a drink in hand. This man was, among other, an author of 11 novels. I don't think you know any of those, and it wasn't any of the novels that made him famous. It weren't his literary achievements, rather it was a single lecture which he delivered in 1959. And in this lecture he confronted the intellectuals of his time, the men of letters, for their snobbish attitude toward the natural sciences. What baffled the gentleman was that his educated contemporaries would not only openly admit, but indeed proudly confess their disinterest in the foundational theorems of the hard sciences. To quote, "A good many times I have been present at gatherings of people who, by the standards of the traditional culture, are thought highly educated, and who have, with considerable gusto, been expressing their incredulity at the illiteracy of scientists. Once or twice I have been provoked and have asked the company how many of them could describe the second law of thermodynamics. The response was cold, it was also negative. Yet I was asking something which is the scientific equivalent of, have you read a work of Shakespeare's? If I had asked an even simpler question, such as, what do you mean by mass or acceleration, which is the scientific equivalent of saying, can you read? The majority of the cleverest people in the Western world have about as much insight into it as their Neolithic ancestors would have had. Today, our common shorthand for C.P. Snow's famous 1959 Reed lecture is the Two Cultures thesis. Indeed, dialogue between the human and the natural sciences does leave much to wish for, and in many instances, it is still, at best, a one-way communication. Heisenberg, for example, will no doubt have read his Goethe, but Goethe, although keenly interested in natural phenomena, detected the radical analytical abstraction from phenomenal reality that is the hallmark of Newtonian physics. And I think that this is the issue still at stake in many a humanist's reluctance towards computational models of cultural symbolic artifacts, including, of course, the computational modeling of narrative. And in order to understand this reluctance, we must go further than the polemic of the Great Divide and the two cultures. Phenomenology versus formalization. Phenomenological approaches conceptualize phenomena in terms of what they are to the human experience. Phenomenology is therefore intrinsically indexical. It always points back to the position of an observer who, by design, is an integral methodological point of reference in its models and theories. This holds true even in our everyday folk phenomenology, inasmuch as in the philosophically reflected phenomenology of, say, Husserl or Heidegger. By contrast, there is no systemic self-awareness built into the formal approach towards an object of study. The formalizer himself or herself, so to speak, is left out of the picture. Indeed, formalization hinges on avoiding indexality in order to arrive at a truly context-free model of its object. The phenomenological triple of object, observer, and model is systematically transformed into that of object, theory, and model. Narratives and their formalization present us with a similar conundrum. We experience narrative as a holistic phenomenon, and yet in narratological formalization we can only approximate it. If narratologists were ever to produce a perfect formula that was able to capture the full richness of the phenomenon, that formula wouldn't be a formula. It would be the phenomenon of narrative itself just doubled. Yet a map of the world scaled one-to-one, as Umberto Eco once put it, makes no sense. Maps have to be reductive and selective. It is their raison d'être to abstract, or else they stop being maps. So let us not fool ourselves. As humanists, we want both, the map and the world, the phenomenon and the formula, the concrete narrative and the abstract narratological model. So the question is, can there be a pie of narrative? What fascinates me about formal and computational approaches toward narrative is exactly this borderline experience of someone who lingers between the phenomenological and the formal. On the one hand, I am perhaps really after something like the pie of narrative, a universal formula that can capture the full richness of any given story. On the other hand, I believe that my approach requires a much broader base in the empirical and phenomenological dimension, for corpus studies have hitherto not played a major role in narratology, despite one of the best-loved foundational myths of formalism, and that myth concerns Prof. Prof, in his 1928 Morphology of the Folktale, implies to have analyzed 100 Russian fairy tales in order to extract his 31-element chain of so-called functions. Yet attempts to rerun the Proprian experiment have raised doubt as far as its methodological rigor is concerned. For example, Claude Bremont and Jean Verrier have shown that a number of tales in the Proprian corpus will in fact not match his sequential formula unless rewritten in a specific way. And apart from obviously tweaking his data, the question is whether Prof did really analyze the entire corpus of 100 fairy tales in a bottom-up mode before he came to his conclusion. I doubt he did that, because if rigid empiricism and an inductive approach and a high-level formula of narrative would have been his goal, then Prof could have built on Anti-Arne and Stith-Thompson, whose taxonomy of elementary motives already listed 2,500 distinctive tale types by 1928, when Prof's work was published. But as Segre remarks, to quote, empirical methodology of Stith-Thompson and the Finnish school does not conflict at all with that of Prof, given that their aims and objectives have nothing in common. So Prof was not an empiricist. In a historical perspective, we are thus faced with at least two parallel strands of research into narrative, empirical folklore studies and formalist theory of narrative functions, which even to date have failed to communicate in a meaningful way. And the same holds true if we consider the relationship between structuralist narratology and empirical studies of literature during the latter half of the 20th century. By the way, that's the distinguished gentleman, no, the dynamic intellectual that you saw on the first slide on the right. Monsieur Schmid himself. The development of modern narratological theory was and is by and large based on the analysis of exemplary canonical texts not on a bottom-up inductive analysis, and Schmid's seminal Discours de récit testifies to this methodological preference. And while we should not expect corpus studies, empirical methods, and collaborative approaches to replace speculative intelligence altogether, it is quite clear that narratology, despite its formalist tradition and its claim to scientification of literary studies, has not really ventured into the empiricist and data-driven research paradigm of the natural sciences. This is where computational narratology might open up a new perspective. But how can we arrange for a fruitful meeting of minds between number-crunching algorithms and human intelligence, between computation and speculation? Before considering what a computational approach might do for narratology, let us first clarify what it cannot and should not claim to be able to do. Let us assume we could feed a computer all the narratives that mankind has ever produced, every single one of them, in all its variations, and that we could also feed it with all the contextual data that define every potential reading of every single narrative in history. Then we'll run some clever analytical algorithms on this huge amount of data and its multidimensional contexts, including algorithms that can detect the meta-logic of variation, genre formation, shifts in cultural conventions, etc. And yet, when asked to produce a real narrative, our expert knowledge system would in all likelihood not be able to outperform a crafty 3-year-old who makes up her first story from scratch. The system might be able to mimic the child's narrative ability, yes, of course. But it won't come up with anything new unless we invest our reading of what it has generated with an interpretation that reflects this automatically produced narrative in the light of our human concerns. It is important to understand that the problem of the machine does not result from complexity or limitations in number crunching. That's just a technological restriction that can be overcome. What matters is the conceptual barrier that sets an automated intelligence apart from a natural one. The machine's conceptual problem results from its not being able to have a problem, at least not in the sense of what we call a problem. The machine cannot intuit on an existential, empathetic level what that is, to be a human being and to have a problem that affects us existentially. For these and related reasons, computer science and artificial intelligence research have more or less given up on modeling human intelligence merely in terms of schema theory, expert knowledge and reasoning systems, and problem-solving logic. Statistical approaches and so-called case-based reasoning have proven indispensable additions, particularly when it comes to building systems that are supposed to help us with everyday problems. Today's so-called intelligent systems no longer pretend to learn from scratch. They apply a mix of computation, logical reasoning, statistics, and analysis of predefined knowledge, that is, structured data. This tension between statistical probability and empirical phenomenology also affects our processing of literature, with or without computers. It can be illustrated by way of a second hypothetical scenario, this time one in which the focus is not on the generation of a narrative, but on its cognitive processing. Let us assume a computational system modeling narrative intelligence has processed, for the first time ever, the first half of Little Red Riding Hood. Now, the crucial question that propels the plot forward arises. Will Little Red Riding Hood escape the wolf? This individual outcome of a particular story is extremely hard to predict on the basis of pure computation, no matter how big an external corpus our machine might be able to consult. For example, I don't think that this graph will help our computational reader to solve the prognostic problem. In this graph, you see the result of an analysis that I did with Google's so-called Ngram viewer. That is an algorithm that can plot the frequency of terms, of keywords that you give the machine. They're up there in that little search box. It generates this graph on the basis of a huge corpus. In this case, I defined the corpus as all English books published between 1800 and 2000. And you see a green line, a blue line. The green line is survive, the term survive. The blue line is the wolf, and the red line is Little Red Riding Hood. And if you cannot see the red line, little wonder, because the red line maps one-to-one onto the baseline, the bottom axis that you see there. Now, why is this result so utterly irrelevant to the initial question? The problem stems from the very notion of problem, which underlies such a statistical approach and the Ngram algorithm. As in most other algorithms that drive our modern-day web-based oracles, statistics conceptualize problems ex post, that is, in the light of a finite state-oriented problem-solving routine. But the human logic that determines the outcome of Little Red Riding Hood is driven by fuzzy considerations, including ethical norms, aesthetic effect, preferences, and not just by probability calculus. However, statistical analysis, the big competitor of intelligence-based reasoning, can nevertheless be of a heuristic value. For example, what really puzzled me about this graph when I had generated it for the first time was that references to Little Red Riding Hood in English literature are so scarce, the red line that you cannot see. But when I compare this result to a second analysis that I ran, it seems that our heroine, Little Red Riding Hood, has clearly enjoyed an astonishing career in English literature from the beginning of the 20th century onward. Here you see a line that represents the analysis in the same corpus of the occurrences of Little Red Riding Hood. Now, this puzzled me. Why no Little Red Riding Hood when there is a wolf, and why so much Little Red Riding Hood when there is no wolf? Now, on second thought, I realized that the discrepancy between the two graphs actually points me to a culture-specific bias that was probably instilled in me, the observer, as a result of my childhood exposure to the Grimm's fairy tale. Simply put, I can no longer think wolf without thinking Little Red Riding Hood. That's how my world of literature works on a phenomenological level, thanks to just one narrative. But it is clearly not the way the world of narratives works empirically. My simplistic Ngram analysis is, of course, only a metaphor and not an example of a valid statistical approach. My analysis that I presented you here is riddled with natural language processing related as well as semantic flaws. For example, it ignores the problem of synonyms, of figurative use of language, etc. Be this as it may, the example illustrates where the methodological problem really lies. It lies in interpretation of data. Machines are not good at it. They're good at looking up things and at executing perfectly logical conclusions very quickly. Every child will understand what the concluding formulaic narratorial statement, "and they lived happily ever after," means. Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother got away, they're safe. The child will arrive at this conclusion by interpretation, not by computation. By contrast, how is an algorithm going to figure out the metaphorical temporal reference in "and they lived happily ever after" that is in a complex temporal expression that uses the grammatical past tense in order to indicate the open-ended future of an existential ever after? So let's use a shortcut. Rather than equipping the machine with a complicated logic that is necessary to produce the correct output from scratch, we can teach it the result. Let human readers annotate Little Red Riding Hood with intelligent semantic interpretations that the machine will understand, and then rerun the statistical analysis. Manual annotation as a shortcut to harnessing the power of computation is the central idea of the Euryclea project, which I will now outline. It serves as an example for one of three variants of computational narratology, one that I suggest to term applied computational narratology. On this slide, and don't even try and figure out the individual components here, it is meant to confuse you. I hope it does the trick. On this slide, you see what systems developers call a component overview. The various modules and functional components of a computer system that they're designing. Now, as you can see, this system architecture is pretty complex. And some of the stuff inside the individual boxes is very technical, such as, for example, source document management. I won't even try and explain what that means. Whereas other boxes have some content that seems easier to understand for us, something like the box that you see expanded in the top left corner, narrative perspective detection. Luckily, this is not a computer science conference, so we can indeed focus on the conceptual and ignore the technical. So let me come straight to the point. What is this system good for? What can it do for us? Its purpose is indicated by the name CLIA, an abbreviation for Collaborative Literature, Exploration and Annotation. And in case you saw that already, we write CLIA with an accent on the E. And if you wonder why I chose to put an accent on this, thanks for trying. It's a private joke. We used that when we submitted an application to Google for research money because we wanted to indicate to them our diacritical concerns, which the American colleagues often tend to ignore. Google found this very funny and gave us $100,000. So next time we're going to try with an accent circonflexe. CLIA, our development project, has a little sister called CATMA, and that is short for Computer-Assisted Textual Markup and Analysis. CATMA has a very human face, as you can see here. It is a software for literary scholars that supports them in the two quintessential philological operations of, one, text annotation. In more technical parlance, we call that markup. And two, in the combined analysis of a source text. Could be a literary text, could be an interview, anything turned into a machine-readable electronic text on the one hand, and its associated annotations on the other hand. The use of a tool like CATMA allows us to handle much larger corpora and to be more consistent in the application of our method and descriptive terms. And to illustrate these two methodological advantages, broader empirical basis and more rigorous application of method, let us look at another hypothetical research project. Let us assume we want to study the historical development of a particular narratological phenomenon throughout a given period, say of analepsis in French non-fiction narratives between 1815 and 1871. This research could perhaps be motivated by a qualitative research hypothesis, such as, I believe that an ellipsis in non-fiction narratives between 1815 and 1871 co-occurs with a reference to pre-Napoleonic political events in French and European history. To validate or reject this hypothesis, we would first have to aggregate a corpus of relevant texts. Then, we annotate every individual text by loading it into a tool like CATMA, highlighting with our mouse the occurrences of analepses and historical events. In a third step, we can then use the tool to analyze the frequency and distribution patterns of analepses and events. Now, when we do that, it's pretty likely that we will suddenly observe other interesting phenomena. For example, we might realize that something like a switch in focalization tends to co-occur with these phenomena in a specific way. So what do? We go back to our corpus, we expand on the annotation, we add more markup to the corpus, and then we rerun the analysis, and so forth until we've eventually exhausted the data, or we've lost interest, or we've spent all our research funds. Now, from a practical point of view, the process that I have just sketched is standard procedure for philologists, and the fact that it is being supported by a computational tool seems hardly worth noticing. However, this seamless integration of a computational approach into our research practice is owed to a characteristic of our approach that is anything but trivial. The conceptual model of the hermeneutic and philological workflow underlying CATMA is not that of a mechanistic input-output pipeline, which we normally associate with computers. Rather, it is interactive, cyclical, and open-ended. Analysis, annotation, and interpretation build on each other, and what brings this process to an end is not a constraint within the system that shouts "solution found," but solely the human user's decision. So here you see a model, a slide depicting the cyclical workflow model. The way in which CATMA emulates and supports our traditional philological practice, however, goes further than the quantitative. The more crucial conceptual characteristic of its qualitative nature is that this tool allows us to do exactly what human narratologists and philologists enjoy doing more than anything else, namely to disagree, to debate, to contradict one another, and even to contradict oneself. I may have good reason to highlight a certain passage in a text as an ellipsis, whereas you think the very same passage should rather be labeled a representation of speech or thought. That's okay in our system. CATMA accepts both variants, and it will also accept others if need should be. To put it in more abstract terms, one particular text can have n different narratological annotations. Some will overlap, others will contradict each other, and what will eventually come out as the communis opinio is a question of discourse and context, not one of dogma. CATMA's conceptual model invites us to work towards that shared goal rather than supporting the illusion of a deterministic labeling of, among other, narratological phenomena once and for all. This is where a third methodological principle comes into play: collaboration. The business of philology has always been a communal effort. We exchange and discuss our findings, and we build on each other's results. Computational tools for philologists need to take cognizance of this well-established routine, and they must accommodate and support this social practice of our scholarship as best as possible. This is why Katma, the tool and little sister that we designed, eventually needed the help of her bigger sister, CLIA. CLIA, as I already mentioned, stands for Collaborative Literature Exploration and Annotation. And with the help of CLIA, we turned our little tool, which was originally a standalone desktop application that you needed to install and run on your own computer, into a so-called web application that is accessible via the internet. Apart from accessibility and lowering the need for maintenance, you don't have to update the program on your own machine. It's being maintained by our software engineers on a server. Apart from that, the main advantage of going this route is that Katma now also includes a repository where users store their annotation files, the so-called markup, and their annotation labels, the so-called tags and tag sets. Through this repository, Katma supports and enforces collaboration. Anybody can use the platform for free. You can use it for free, on condition that they are willing to share their annotations with other researchers. But note that the platform will automatically document who produced what. So your willingness to collaborate does not entail losing your intellectual property. My annotation of say à la recherche will always be identifiable as my annotation, even though you might use it for one of your specific research projects or use parts of it, or even rewrite parts of my annotation. Now, the benefits of adopting such a collaborative computer-assisted approach in the narratological analysis of corpora seems obvious. We can share the workload of narratological annotation. We will be able to use and reuse somebody else's data in later projects. We can, over time, jointly build a much broader and more precise empirical base of narratologically annotated texts that will eventually allow us to engage in historical studies aimed at tracing the development and transformation of narratological phenomena throughout literary history. And then there are, of course, the possibilities to relate our narratological data to similar data sets in other disciplines, for example, to those of historians, of linguists, of philosophers, etc. So we're breaking out of a disciplinary isolation. We're no longer insular. We're interconnecting with other disciplines through the data, the source data, and through the annotation that we add to the data. In more abstract terms, the collaborative use of a web platform like Katma opens up at least three methodological perspectives for narratology. One, creating and exploring synergy among individual research projects. Two, complementing narratology with an empirical methodology and base. And three, interfacing narratology with other disciplines on the level of the fundamental data rather than only via the import and export of theories or high-level interpretations. However, with this, we still haven't really made use of the computer's abilities. We have more or less emulated what we've always done in our traditional research practice and given it an empirical twist. But what about the promise of the computer as a tool that will make our life easier? Wouldn't it be nice if some of the laborious narratological annotation tasks could be automated? Wouldn't it be helpful if, say, the Katma web platform would also include some background function that learns how to detect a potential analepsis on its own? We want something like Google's or Amazon's clever algorithms, which have quickly learned to generate surprisingly relevant suggestions for where to click or what to buy. This is the goal of Hure, our current and third phase of Katma's development. Its prefix, Hure, alludes to the notion of heuristics, because that's essentially what we're after, an automated heuristic functionality. Simply put, the idea is to analyze all the primary and secondary user-produced data, the original narratives as well as their various annotations that are collected on our platform by applying so-called machine learning procedures. Machine learning procedures are algorithms that run in the background. Their task is to identify and test co-occurrence and distribution patterns in the two data sets, that of the text corpora on the one hand and that of the annotation corpora on the other hand, while these grow larger and larger. A machine learning approach is based on a statistical and probabilistic approach. It is not intelligent. Its pattern recognition algorithms have no idea what analepsis and prolepsis mean and what semantic and aesthetic purpose they might serve. But this shocking ignorance toward content and semantics enables machine learning algorithms to identify correlations which, albeit hermeneutically absurd, can prove statistically valid. For example, and believe me, this is really just a made-up example, a machine learning algorithm might find out that there is a 98% chance for the occurrence of an analepsis in À la recherche du temps perdu if the 382nd character to the left of a new sentence is an exclamation mark and the third narratological phenomenon to its right is a switch from zero to internal focalization. Now, if this approach strikes you as absurd, then you're not really a hardcore narratologist. For doesn't this resemble the approach that Archimedes took when he came up with pi, and that Prof took when he, too, abstracted from the phenomena and focused on the functions? Admittedly, Prof's concept of function was not as removed from the phenomenological and experiential dimension of narrative as a purely statistical model in its radical mathematical reductionism will be. And of course, Prof's notion of function has to be conceptualized historically and disciplinary to do it full justice. But the two approaches as such are based on the same methodological principle. Formalism, in its aesthetic as much as in its mathematical variant, forces us to abstract from the phenomenon, only that we've taken the exercise a step further. The purpose of augmenting an annotation platform like CATMA with heuristic functionality is not to make intelligent manual annotation and interpretation obsolete, nor to automate narratological text description altogether. All that a computational heuristics of narrative aims to do is to propose to the human expert a plausible narratological categorization. Such a system does not insist on a specific predefined narratological theory either. It merely learns from analyzing the hopefully intelligent annotation output of human readers. In other words, we are not after a narratological Kim Jong-il. In his recent article in the web-based Living Handbook for Narratology, Inderjit Mani has defined computational narratology as, I quote, the study of narrative from the point of view of computation and information processing. It focuses on the algorithmic processes involved in creating and interpreting narratives, modeling narrative structure in terms of formal, computable representations. Now, note the three types of computational narratology that Mani distinguishes in the following sentence. The scope of computational narratology, he continues, includes the approaches to storytelling in artificial intelligence systems and computer and video games, the automatic interpretation and generation of stories, and the exploration and testing of literary hypotheses through mining of narrative structure from corpora. Applied computational narratology, as I propose to call the third version, combines the methods of computational modeling with philology's traditional hermeneutic interest in explicating the meaning of narrative as man's privileged symbolic practice. Its principal credo is that hermeneutic and philological interest can go hand in hand with formal modeling, provided that formalization can be related back to the experiential realm of phenomena. To build systems that can translate this credo into a practical tool is a difficult task, and it is a fascinating one at the same time, because it affords us with an opportunity to look at narrative from a computational perspective without compromising our philological identity. And contrary to what the two cultures folklore implied, this is indeed a methodological call for action that was raised long before C.P. Snow, namely at the beginning of the 19th century, when the German poet Heinrich von Kleist wrote, "One could distinguish two classes of men, those who are capable of metaphors and those who are capable of formulae. Those who are capable of both are too few. They do not form a class." Ladies and gentlemen, the purpose of my talk was to invite you to join a non-existing class. Thank you very much.